So let's go to the Moses versus Jesus, the way I'm
Yeah.
putting it. Let's look at some things that we believe Jesus did away with and why.
Well, before we do that, can we look at Matthew 5:17? He says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the Torah or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished," as the NRSV. "Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." I'm just a simple Jew. How does that mean that he's abolished the Torah?
Most Christians would just argue that no, Jesus obviously did not leave us lawless as the Messiah, the supreme agent of God who supersedes all other prophets. He gives his own law, and Paul calls it the law of Messiah.
So what are these commandments that he refers to in verse 19? They're not the Torah and the prophets he just mentioned?
I believe it's the ones that follow. So
okay.
as we keep reading, see,
Okay.
I mean, you have to keep reading, right?
I've heard that interpretation, sure.
So let's keep reading, and I'll ask you a question about,
Sure.
well, here the NABRE has retaliation. An eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That is in the Torah as far as I know.
Absolutely.
So God allowed, under the old, what we Christians call the Old Covenant law, he allowed retaliation in kind, right? So you...
Not just allowed, in some contexts it's required.
Right, so you take out my eye, I'll take out your eye, you burn my house, I'll burn your house. So Jesus says, okay, you have heard it in the law.
Yeah.
But I say, so the but I says, as you know, there's, I believe, 6 or so contrasts, 6 or so but I say. That sounds like a contrast. And then he says, offer no resistance to one who is evil. When someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the other. If anyone wants to go to the courts, should anyone press into you and so on. So, and then he gives love of enemies, famous passage, right? In connection, I believe, with that Old Covenant law of judicial punishment in kind. Jesus here sounds like he is saying, basically, it's a commandment now, not kill your enemy, basically.
I don't know that we even need to go to the Hebrew here to get an insight. I think even from this English translation, I think there's different ways that could be interpreted.
So when Jesus says what he says in Matthew 5, if someone strikes you on your right cheek, he doesn't say, do what the law says. He says, turn the other cheek.
I think it should trouble everybody because it doesn't make a lot of sense. Something is missing here, right? Okay. Is he being hyperbolic? We're missing a piece of the puzzle. And one answer is this is hyperbole. He doesn't actually mean this. Right? Poke out your eye. He doesn't actually mean poke out your eye. That's understood.
Sure. Right.
I suppose there's a number of different possible explanations. It's hyperbolic language.
So whatever exaggeration it is, it's not an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, right?
He definitely seems to be contrasting it with the Torah law.
Okay. That's fair.
That does seem to be the plain explanation.
That's fair.
And in that case, to me, maybe this is a Deuteronomy 13 situation. It says, don't add and don't take away any commandments from the Torah. And the very next verse talks about someone who comes and every word that I command you here in your translation, you shall be careful to observe, neither adding to it or subtracting from it. If you're saying Jesus subtracted from the commandments of the Torah, well then, from my perspective, verses 2 and on might apply to him.
If he's not the Messiah.
Even if he is,
even if he is?
No, he couldn't be the Messiah by definition. If a Jewish Messiah who's not named Jesus came and said, I've now made the pig kosher, that man would not be the Messiah.
Do you believe Jesus made the pig kosher in his teachings?
I don't think he did.
How about Mark 7? You're familiar with that, I'm sure.
I absolutely am. And boy, if we want to get into that, that's...
Well, I actually wanted to ask you about verse 15. Mark 7:15, Jesus says, nothing that enters one from outside can defile that person. Now, the context is food.
Well, not exactly.
Okay, you don't believe it's food. All right.
No, it's partly food, but I think there's a broader context here.
And then he goes on to say that all foods are clean.
Does he though? So let's look at this. No, that's a great passage to look at. Let's read 7:19, and we can't look at the whole passage, but I really think this passage has more to do with the Pharisee understanding of ritual cleanliness. Torah has this concept of tahor and tameh, of clean and unclean. And the rabbis expand upon this to where you can be unclean like third and fourth hand. And I think that's the context here. So the NIV says, for it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach and then out of his body. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. Now, I know you're a Greek scholar as well. Does the word Jesus even appear in the Greek?
No, that's
It's
true.
a paraphrase in the NIV. Okay.
Right. Who else is the subject, though?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree with you. The NRSV, since it enters not the heart but the stomach and goes out into the sewer, thus he declared all foods clean. Now, both the NIV and NRSV have that in parentheses, at least in my version here. Does your version have it in parentheses?
As you know, the Greek doesn't use parentheses, so that's
no, I understand, but they're adding grammatical things, or I think the distinction is lost by Christians, in my opinion, between in Leviticus 11 when it lays down the laws of tumah v'tahara, of clean and unclean. It says these are the regulations concerning animals, birds, everything living that moves in the water, and every creature that moves about on the ground. You must distinguish between the unclean and the clean, between living creatures that may be eaten and those that may not be eaten. So there's two separate types of categories here. There are animals that are clean and that are unclean, and there are animals that may be eaten, maybe not be eaten. Those have overlap between them, but they're actually separate issues, and they're dealt with in distinct ways in Leviticus 11. Deuteronomy 14 then reiterates this and focuses more on what may be eaten or what may not be eaten, not so much the clean and the unclean. And where the confusion comes from, I think, is a lot of Christians will talk about, they'll say, well, I eat biblically clean. Okay, well, now you're making a confusion that Leviticus 11 distinguishes these two categories, the eaten and the not eaten. And Jews use a terminology, they'll say kosher and not kosher. Kosher is just a Hebrew word that means proper. And but it really translates in a modern or medieval way what the Bible in Leviticus 11 means, that which may be eaten and which may not be eaten. And what I think Jesus is doing here in Mark 7, which is also parallel to Matthew 15, is it's not that he's declaring all food is clean or may be eaten. He's saying food doesn't cause ritual impurity. And just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, according to the Pharisees, if I take a piece of steak, perfectly glatt kosher steak, and I bring it into a cemetery, a priest then is not allowed to eat that steak because it would make him unclean. That's a law Leviticus 11 doesn't say anything about. The meat that's ritually unclean can't make a person unclean. And here he's saying in this kind of, he's using a parable in a sense, or not really a parable. He's explaining it passes through your body and leaves you. It doesn't change you, making you unclean, which is 100% correct based on Leviticus 11. The Pharisees, however, had a different take on it. The Pharisee, the definition of a Pharisee is someone who eats as non-ritual meat, meaning non-sacrificial meat in a state of ritual cleanliness. So the Pharisees believed if a menstruating woman touched a piece of beef and then you ate that beef, you would become ritually unclean. I think that's what Jesus is talking about.
Yeah, Paul understood Jesus to be referring to food. Can we agree on that? Because in Romans 14:14, he says, I am convinced in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself. It is unclean for someone who thinks it is unclean. So for Paul, the former Benjamite Pharisee, and then the context in 14, for the sake of food, do not destroy the work of God. Everything is indeed clean, and I believe that's the same Old Greek word that translates the Leviticus clean and unclean foods. So if you check your Septuagint, you'll see that Paul is actually using the same Greek clean and unclean word to contrast his understanding of how now in the Lord Jesus. So that's how Paul later understands Jesus saying, in case, as to be fair.
Or he understands it the way I understood it, which is,
well, he says, for the sake of food, do not destroy the work of God. Yeah. Everything is indeed clean. Is that not food?
Absolutely, it's food.
Okay.
But the question is, are we talking about a menstruating woman or a Gentile touched a piece of meat, making it unclean? And then the Pharisees says, I can't eat that meat. It was touched by a menstruating woman.
Right.
And Paul is saying, why are you making this a
Well,
stumbling block, telling somebody if they eat this, they'll become unclean? Eating
yeah.
food doesn't make you unclean.
Yeah, in Romans
So-
14, I don't think there's anything about menstruating women, but the commandment of the temple tax, right? So there's a temple tax commandment, and you're familiar with the one in Matthew 17. Came to Capernaum, the collectors of the temple tax approached Peter and said, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? Now that is, as far as I know, in the Torah, that is law. Yes, he said, Peter, of course, he's a Torah-keeping Jew, right? At this point. So when Peter comes to the house before he had time to speak, from who do the kings of the earth take tolls or census tax? From their subjects or from their foreigners? When he said from foreigners, Jesus said to him, then the subjects are exempt or free, some translations. But that we may not offend them, now the them are the collectors. Go to the sea, drop in a hook, so then they get a coin from the fish. Give that to them. I have a question about why Jesus is saying that the citizens, so he regards his apostles as citizens, obviously, of the coming kingdom. So he says, as citizens, you guys are free, but so you do not offend them, in verse 27, don't offend the collectors of the temple tax, their fellow Jews who are only doing what Torah mandates, as far as I know. So why would Jesus say that if he's a Torah-keeping Jew?
So I want to understand this in its historical context. So the rabbis had this stranglehold in the temple, and one of the laws that they institute is that there's only one valid way of paying temple tax, and that is with the Tyrian half shekel. It says there a double drachma. It was so the Tyrian shekel was a tetradrachma. This was a half of a tetradrachma. They were paying. It could only be paid with this Tyrian coin, Tyrian from Tyre, which is on the coast of Lebanon. And presumably the reason for this is the rabbis determined that was the only coin whose silver purity they trusted. This is one of the reasons I think that Jesus overthrew the table of the money changers. So you would come to the temple with perfectly good silver, and the money changers would say, hey, we don't accept your silver. You've got to exchange your silver for the Tyrian half shekel. Now, what problem might Jesus have with the Tyrian half shekel? Whose picture is on the Tyrian half shekel? Not Caesar, right? That's a different story. The Tyrian half shekel has the inscription belonging to Tyre, the holy city of refuge. And on the front of it is the image of Melkart, also known as Baal, who is the god of Tyre. So I wonder if the reason that Jesus did not want to engage in playing with the Tyrian half shekel is that this was a coin with the picture of Baal on it, and that was the only coin that the temple tax collectors would accept. You could melt down and have 100% or 4.9 pure silver, and they'd say, nope, we got to have the Tyrian half shekel with the picture of Baal on it. So maybe that's why.
So the coin Jesus gets from the fish.
Look it up, Tyrian shekel. Yeah, maybe that had Baal's picture. I don't know. Maybe Baal's picture was rubbed off on that one. I have no idea.
All right, but they still paid it, so they wouldn't offend them. He says. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Thanks for that, and thank you.
Another possibility is what you said, that he abolished one of the commandments of the Torah. And we have to acknowledge that's the possibility. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this fascinating conversation.